Chinul's Thought by Robert E. Buswell, Jr. From Introduction, The Life and Thought of Chinul in Tracing Back the Radiance, Chinul's Korean Way of Zen. Sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, Chinul's approach to practice and enlightenment. The varied descriptions of practice and enlightenment appearing in Buddhist scriptures fostered numbers of analytical studies by Buddhist theoreticians. Indeed, the many schools of Buddhism which arose in China each had their own approach to practice and enlightenment. As factionalism developed within the church, considerable controversy arose over the effectiveness and authenticity of these different approaches. Chinul, in his Dharma collection and special practice record, discusses a number of them and compares the analyses of Zheng Guan, Zongmi, and Yan Shou. Zongmi had examined this question in some detail in various works and became a strong advocate of an approach consisting of initial sudden awakening followed by gradual cultivation. Such a course was, for him, the most comprehensive and accurate description of the process of practice. And since it could be shown to apply to all Buddhist cultivators, from beginners with little spiritual background to experienced meditators, it was the ideal teaching method. Furthermore, Zongmi saw sudden awakening, gradual cultivation as a perfect bridge between the practices of Chan and the scholastic schools, for Hozi's teachings and the approach to practice outlined in the Huayan school both followed a similar course. Due to the demise of the Hozi school after the death of Zongmi, this approach never gained widespread favor among Chan followers in China, and the rival approach of sudden awakening, sudden cultivation, as advocated by masters in the Linji line, reigned supreme. Chinul, however, was convinced by Zongmi's arguments in favor of sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, and went into considerable depth in his own investigations of the question. Through his influence, the sudden awakening, gradual cultivation approach flourished in Korea and received at least tacit acceptance by most teachers in the later tradition. Even though it has had its detractors among Korean Son teachers, especially those using the radical Imje, Linji methods, it is clearly the hallmark of the Korean tradition and is discussed sympathetically by such later Son figures as Taigo Po, 1301 to 1382, and Sosan Hyujong, 1520 to 1604. Chinul's attention to the question did not arise merely from theoretical interest. Rather, he feared that an improper understanding of spiritual development would hinder the progress of Buddhist students in either doctrinal or Son schools. And indeed, there is evidence in abundance that such a situation had developed in the Buddhism of his era. By giving a detailed description of sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, and the reasons for favoring it over other alternatives, he hoped to present an approach to Buddhism which could serve his students as a practical guide to meditation. Zongmi and Chinul gave parallel accounts of the import of sudden awakening and gradual cultivation. The ordinary person generally assumes that his physical frame is his body, and his thought processes are his mind. Some day, however, he might make the sudden discovery that, in their original forms, his body is actually the true Dharma body of all the Buddhas, and his mind is actually the void and calm, numinous awareness of the true mind. He would then understand that he is inherently endowed with the Buddha nature, and that this nature is originally untainted by defilements of any sort, and fully endowed with all the meritorious qualities of the Buddhas. This discovery is initial sudden awakening. Although the student may then understand that he is essentially a Buddha, his actions are still in large part guided by the force of long ingrained habits which continue to involve him in defilements like greed, hatred, and delusion. For this reason, even after the initial awakening to his fundamental Buddha nature, the student must learn to apply his understanding in the ordinary world and transform his knowledge into useful and proper action. This requires that he train himself to counter the arising of defilements and to develop the whole range of positive spiritual qualities. Then he will be a Buddha in fact as well as theory. This process is gradual cultivation. However, because he has already had the initial awakening to his mind nature, which is eternally free of defilement and endowed innately with all these qualities, he counters defilements while knowing that there is actually nothing which is being counteracted, and develops spiritual qualities while understanding that there is actually nothing which is being developed. His continued cultivation allows his initial understanding to infuse gradually all of his being until that absolute Buddha wisdom and the relative positive qualities of Buddhahood have become an inexorable part of his patterns of thought and behavior. The person becomes a perfect saint in both understanding and conduct. Buddhahood is achieved, and he is able, as is no other individual, to help other living beings. In this approach, the awakening to the noumenal essence of the mind is accomplished suddenly. However, the annihilation of falsity and the development of the positive qualities of sainthood are accomplished only gradually. Zongmi compares this process to human maturation. Although a newborn infant possesses all its sense faculties and is endowed physically with all the organs and capacities of an adult, it takes years to reach its full adult potential. With Buddhist practice, it is just the same. Through sudden awakening, one is endowed with the same understanding and ability to help others as are all the Buddhas. It requires much supplementary training before that potential becomes fact in the everyday world, however. This necessity for gradual cultivation after awakening does not mean that the content of the awakening experience is altered in any way by its subsequent development. Rather, this practice involves the perfection of skill in means and the refinement of the discriminative faculties of wisdom, which expand the ability to express one's enlightenment to others and help them realize it for themselves. Without this continued cultivation after awakening, the student loses vitality and, accordingly, humanity. And without humanity, that basic empathy of sentient being to sentient being, which is the underlying force activating the Bodhisattva's compassion, the entire purpose of practice, to ease the sufferings of all sentient beings and lead them along the road to enlightenment, is also lost. In this outline, both awakening and cultivation have two distinct aspects, which Chinul discusses in the Dharma collection and special practice record: the initial understanding awakening and the subsequent realization awakening, and the cultivation of thoughtlessness and the cultivation which deals with all matters. The understanding awakening is the initial awakening which precedes cultivation proper. It occurs as a result of the thorough understanding of the mental properties, that is, the nature and characteristics of the mind, as well as its essence and function. This is the relative awakening, which allows one to enter into the 10 faiths, the preliminary stage before starting out on the Bodhisattva path. The subsequent realization awakening, which occurs after cultivation has matured, is the ultimate awakening. The understanding gained through the initial awakening finally permeates one's entire being, and one truly enters onto the Bodhisattva path at the initial abiding stage of the arousing of the bodhicitta. The cultivation of thoughtlessness is the absolute aspect of cultivation in which the mind remains unified with the undifferentiated noumenal mind nature. It is essentially passive. That is, the individual simply remains in a state of harmony with the essential suchness of the self-nature. The cultivation which deals with all matters is the relative aspect of cultivation that develops expedient practices to counter negative habits and nurture positive qualities. It is essentially dynamic. That is, it brings the noumenal calmness of thoughtlessness to bear on the manner of one's reaction to sense objects, ensuring that those reactions are positive and beneficial. This cultivation does not involve the discriminative processes of mind. It is rather the activation of the noumenal nature, which is possible because of the principle that essence and function are non-dual, that is, simply two complementary aspects of the mind. The unique feature of the sudden awakening gradual cultivation approach is that, unlike other styles of practice, the absolute and relative aspects of both awakening and cultivation are kept in careful balance, so that each aspect supports the development of the other. The sudden awakening at the beginning of the student's practice assures a proper attitude toward cultivation. Without this foundation, there is a constant danger that the student might find Buddhist practice intimidating. He might then assume that he lacks the capacity to develop all its many facets, and therefore content himself with cultivating only relative practices, complacency which might make him neglect the goal of practice for the practice itself. Gradual cultivation ensures that awakening is kept dynamic. Through cultivation, awakening is applied in ordinary life, protecting the student from indifference to the sufferings of others and the compulsion to seek quietude and isolation, which often characterizes ascetic hermits. By the same token, the two aspects of cultivation are also kept in equilibrium, ensuring that cultivation develops with balanced stress on both the absolute and relative spheres. In an approach to practice based solely on thoughtlessness, the undifferentiated noumenal nature plays the central role in development. This could lead to a nihilistic attitude in which calmness and aloofness, concomitants of the noumenon, predominate. Conversely, developing wholesome qualities and countering unwholesome tendencies, the approach of the cultivation which deals with all matters, could lead the student to assume that there is actually something real which needs to be counteracted or developed. By accepting the separate reality of individual dharmas, he would find himself sinking deeper into the relative world of the phenomenal. Hence, rather than lessening his attachment to the things of the world and adverting to the mind nature which is their source, he might end up hopelessly immersed in mundane affairs. By emphasizing the simultaneous practice of both aspects of cultivation, their unitary nature is clarified. Thoughtlessness is the essence of the cultivation which deals with all matters. The cultivation which deals with all matters is the function of thoughtlessness. Hence both noumenal and phenomenal practices are developed equally in this approach. At first glance it might seem that an approach in which awakening precedes cultivation defies all the dictates of logic. Surely spiritual development through meditation, character training, and meritorious action is essential because it prepares the ground for awakening. While common sense might require that relative practices must be developed before the awakening into the absolute, Chinul, and indeed almost all masters of both Son and doctrine, summarily dismiss this gradual cultivation, sudden awakening approach. It is fallacious because it relies on the development of relative practices which substantiate the reality of conditionally arisen phenomena, all of which are essentially illusory. Since these practices are not based on an understanding of one's innate Buddhahood, one's innate freedom from defilement, and one's innate endowment with all the qualities of sainthood, the student will be forced to undergo a long and bitter period of practice during which he will unavoidably be beset by spells of disillusionment and frustration. And this critique does not even mention the old question: how can conditioned practices produce the realization of the unconditioned realm? Because true practice begins with sudden awakening, the student's progress will be smooth and natural. Sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, is consequently a practical approach that assures a greater likelihood of success than does gradual cultivation, sudden awakening. Sudden awakening, sudden cultivation, which became the Chan orthodoxy through the strong advocacy of the Linji school, is also viewed with some suspicion by Chinul. This approach assumes that, since the mind nature is fully endowed with all meritorious qualities, once it is fully revealed through a complete awakening, nothing remains to be cultivated, because all the qualities of that nature are simultaneously revealed as well. Hence a sudden awakening to the mind nature brings the instantaneous perfection of all meritorious qualities, sudden cultivation. While such an approach seems the ideal style of practice because it does not indulge in relative expedience, Chinul finds it deceptive. Certainly it leads too easily to a nihilistic attitude toward practice. Since everyone is inherently endowed with the Buddha nature, and since all the defilements in the relative world are inherently void, there are really no wholesome qualities to be developed. They are all present naturally. No defilements to be counteracted. They are all void. No goal to be reached in the practice. Buddhahood is already achieved. It places excessive emphasis on the noumenal aspect of practice and neglects the development of the phenomenal qualities which allow that noumenon to manifest clearly in the ordinary world. The advocate of the sudden awakening, sudden cultivation approach can find many examples in Son literature which seem to show that some people did gain perfect enlightenment instantly without having to continue with gradual cultivation. From the standpoint of this life, such examples apparently authenticate the sudden awakening, sudden cultivation approach. If past lives are taken into account, however, it is clear that sudden perfection in this life is based on long, gradual development through many previous existences. These individuals have, at some past time, had a sudden awakening, begun their long-term gradual cultivation, and in this life, seemingly without effort, completed their practice. Hence, sudden awakening, sudden cultivation, is actually only perfected sudden awakening, gradual cultivation. That is, the sudden awakening, gradual cultivation of people with advanced spiritual capacity. Sudden awakening, sudden cultivation only applies to cultivation matured during the life in which final enlightenment occurs. It is not valid throughout the whole process of spiritual training over many lives. As sudden awakening, gradual cultivation applies to any number of lives and to any stage of spiritual development, it is accordingly a more comprehensive description of the path of practice than is sudden awakening, sudden cultivation. Since sudden awakening, gradual cultivation is broad enough to encompass all other approaches to enlightenment, it acts again as an ideal vehicle for bringing together the Son and scholastic schools. Chinul demonstrates that the outline of sudden awakening, gradual cultivation in the Hotze school can be explicated just as clearly using Hwaom terminology. Through sudden awakening, the student realizes the undifferentiated noumenon, the Buddha of unmoving wisdom, and discovers that his karmic activities are all identical to those of the Buddhas, and are all arisen according to conditions from the productionless self-nature. This realization commences his bodhisattva career. While understanding that he and others are all non-existent, the bodhisattva still recognizes that sentient beings are immersed in suffering, and out of compassion he decides to cultivate the vast vows and practices of Samantabhadra in order to rescue them. These myriads of practices are the stage of gradual cultivation, and carry him through all the levels of the bodhisattva path until Buddhahood is finally attained. But the only reason that the bodhisattva is able to continue with his arduous practice over innumerable eons is because he has already realized his true nature through his initial sudden awakening. As Chinul notes in Encouragement to Practice, where he discusses the fact that suddenness and gradualness in the scholastic teachings are more a matter of the individual's spiritual capacity than the inherent character of the teaching. Even in the scholastic sects there appears the doctrine that sentient beings, in this wise, all belong to the Buddha's spiritual family, and in the land of birth and death can suddenly awaken to the Buddha vehicle in which realization and cultivation are simultaneous. So how is it that the Southern school alone involves a sudden approach? Lest this convoluted discussion leave the reader more bemused than enlightened, I might add that Chinul himself admits that all this controversy over the proper approach to Buddhist practice is somewhat tedious and overdrawn. Although the theoretical descriptions of awakening and cultivation may differ, for the truly ardent student they all come down to essentially the same thing. If awakening fully penetrates to the fundamental mind nature, it cannot be obstructed by any sort of relative gradual cultivation. And by the same token, if cultivation is done properly, it is associated with the understanding which only comes through awakening. Hence, in all cases, from beginners on the spiritual quest to those who have nearly perfected their practice, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation provides, in Chinul's view, the most complete and accurate description of the entire course of spiritual development. Chinul's methods of meditation. Chinul's ecumenical attitude toward Buddhist philosophy led him to develop a remarkably eclectic approach toward meditation practice. While that approach remained fundamentally Son in focus, he incorporated a number of techniques which would appeal to practitioners of differing capacities and needs. It was Chinul's accomplishment to demonstrate how these techniques, the characteristic practices of independent sects in China, could all work together to guide Buddhist students toward the same goal of liberation. Chinul regarded these methods as expedient devices designed to assist different types of people in their own spiritual development, and he insisted that all would eventually lead to the same result, for the adept who cultivated with sincerity and vigor. As his biographer, Kim Kun-soo, first noted, Chinul tailored three main styles of Son practice, which show the direct influences of his three enlightenment experiences. The balanced cultivation of Samādhi and Prajñā, deriving from the Platform Sutra, faith and understanding according to the complete and sudden teachings of the Hua Om school, from Li Tongxuan's exposition of the Avatamsaka Sutra, and finally the shortcut approach of Hua Du investigation from the records of Ta Hui. These styles were intended to instruct people of inferior, average, and superior spiritual capacities respectively. To supplement these three basic methods, Chinul taught two additional techniques for people of highest and lowest capacity: the approach of no mind, thoughtlessness, and the recollection of the Buddha's name. He explained that each method could be followed exclusively, or a progression from the simpler techniques to the more difficult could be cultivated. The wide variety of approaches available in Chinul's system allowed people at all stages of spiritual ability to follow a path suited to their own unique needs, and reach finally the goal of Buddhahood. Each of these 5 approaches to practice will be recounted briefly in the following pages. In his early works like Encouragement to Practice and Secrets on Cultivating the Mind, Chinul places special emphasis on the need to cultivate Samādhi and Prajñā in tandem, and to maintain alertness and calmness equally, both standard dictums which find application in nearly all methods of Buddhist practice. Buddhist spiritual culture traditionally involves 3 major forms of training: ethical restraint, shila, mental absorption, samadhi, and transcendental wisdom, prajñā. At the beginning of his training, the Buddhist student is expected to learn to control his physical reactions to the objects in his environment by observing simple moral guides. This observance gradually brings under the sway of Dharma the coarser manifestations of defilements through bodily actions and speech, and it weakens the normally exclusive interest in sense-related experiences. As the disentanglement from the senses accelerates, a new inner focus develops. Gradually, the mind learns through meditation to be content merely within itself. The mental processes are progressively calmed, and the student achieves absorption, pure mental concentration. Eventually, The concentrated power created through this absorption is turned toward an investigation of himself, his world, and the relationship between the two. This investigation develops wisdom, which teaches him about the processes of life and leads him to discover the true nature of himself and indeed of all things. Full development of such understanding turns back the power of ignorance, which ordinarily impels the mind to take an interest in the senses. Simultaneously, the student breaks the inveterate tendency toward craving, the active aspect of ignorance which produces greed, hatred, and the whole range of defilements, and liberation is achieved. The term son is the Korean pronunciation of the Chinese transliteration of the Sanskrit word dhyana, which is equatable with samadhi. In the Son school, however, the word carries a different connotation. As Zongmi explains, it is a comprehensive term for both samadhi and prajñā, and Son practice is intended to lead to the rediscovery of the original enlightened source of all sentient beings, the Buddha nature, or mind ground. The awakening to this source is called prajñā. The cultivation of this awakening is called samadhi. Chinul explains as well that samadhi and prajñā are also an abbreviation for the threefold training in Shila, Samadhi, and Prajñā, just described. Consequently, Son training involves the entire range of Buddhist spiritual endeavor from the beginning stages of morality to the highest stages of wisdom. Two major interpretations of samadhi and prajñā are possible, a relative form and an absolute form. Chinul discusses both at length in Encouragement to Practice. The relative type of samadhi and prajñā taught in the gradual school deals with objects in the conditioned realm in order to remove impurities. It is similar to the preceding description of samadhi and prajñā. Samadhi, in its guise of calmness, accords with the noumenal voidness. It is used to counter the tendency toward distraction. Prajñā, in its guise of alertness, accords with phenomenal plurality. It is used to stimulate the mind out of the occasional dullness, which obscures its natural penetrative quality. In their relative form, samadhi and prajñā are instruments for counteracting ignorance and defilements. They are used until enlightenment is achieved. Chinul followed the sudden approach to enlightenment, in which awakening precedes cultivation, and his interpretation of samadhi and prajñā differs accordingly from this relative type. Chinul's approach, the second type of samadhi and prajñā, is the absolute form, the samadhi and prajñā of the self-nature. This new interpretation of samadhi and prajñā was first propounded in the Chan school by Shen Hui and is the major focus of the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch. Here, samadhi and prajñā are viewed as two aspects of the same self-nature. Although each has its own specific role, they are not to be differentiated. Samadhi is the essence of the self-nature and is characterized by calmness. Prajñā is the function of that self-nature and is characterized by alertness. Although the ways in which they manifest are distinguishable, both are based in the non-dual self-nature. Hence, samadhi is actually the essence of prajñā, and prajñā is the functioning of samadhi. Because of this mutual identification, samadhi no longer implies detached absorption, which is entirely removed from sense experience. It is rather that same absorption during contact with sense objects, a dynamic conception of samadhi. Prajñā is not simply a discriminative faculty which critically investigates phenomena and exposes their essential voidness. It carries the more passive sense of operating as the calm essence amid phenomena, and it manifests as radiance, or bare awareness. In this conception, both samadhi and prajñā are centered in the unmoving self-nature, and are consequently always identified with this absolute non-dual state. Even when the two faculties are operating as calmness or alertness in the conditioned sphere, activities which would seem to parallel those of the relative samadhi and prajñā, they never leave their unity in the unconditioned mind nature. Even after the sudden awakening to the self-nature reveals the identity of samadhi and prajñā, the power of habit will continue to immerse the student in defilements. These defilements can disturb the original harmony of the self-nature in such a way that one of its aspects of essence or function becomes distorted. If essence predominates, dullness might result from excessive calmness. If function is exaggerated, distraction might develop from excessive alertness. At such a time, it would be appropriate to use the relative practice of samadhi and prajñā in order to deal with the problem at hand. By employing the right countermeasure, the mind is kept in harmony, and rapid progress in overcoming residual habits can be expected. For this reason, Chinul stresses the need to keep both calmness and alertness in scrupulous balance, so that the natural powers of the mind remain at optimum level. At all stages in the student's development, Samādhi and Prajñā constitute an integral part of his practice. Although the designations might differ according to the level of his progress, the principles remain the same. Indeed, regardless of the method of meditation the student is practicing, he must always be attentive to the equilibrium between these two elements if the methods are to be brought to a successful conclusion. As Chinul observes time and again throughout his writings, the success of any practice depends on a sudden awakening at the beginning of one's efforts to the fact of one's fundamental Buddhahood. Without the confidence that such experience brings, the long ages of struggle the Bodhisattva contemplates would be unbearable for even the most enthusiastic of adepts. To induce this awakening is the purpose of faith and understanding, according to the complete and sudden teachings, the practice based on Hua-Om theory intended for the majority of students. The discussion which follows recapitulates the explication of Li Tongxuan's thought given in Chinul's complete and sudden attainment of Buddhahood. The unmoving wisdom of Buddhahood, otherwise known as the wisdom of universal brightness, is the source of all dualistic phenomena, including Buddhas and sentient beings. Through faith and understanding that this unmoving wisdom is identical to the discriminative thoughts of sentient beings, the individual realizes that even in his present deluded state, he is, and indeed has always been, a perfect Buddha. By understanding this fact, at the very beginning of the spiritual quest, at the first of the 10 levels of faith, the student becomes fully endowed with the wisdom and compassion of Buddhahood in potential form. This accomplishment was usually assumed to occur only at the arousing of the bodhicitta stage of the 10 abidings, and only after the adept had supposedly passed through all 10 levels of faith for 10,000 kalpas. But through the knowledge of this fundamental wisdom, non-retrogressive faith is established, assuring the student's continued progress on the bodhisattva path and perfecting the other constituents of the 10 stages of faith. Accordingly, the student is able to enter the initial abiding stage directly. At that stage, there is immediate experience of the fact that he is a Buddha, and the former tacit faith and understanding are confirmed. With the tremendous potential of the great effortless functioning inherent in Buddhahood, the subsequent stages of the bodhisattva path are instantly completed. Consequently, the wisdom of universal brightness is not simply the origin of sentient beings and Buddhas. Every accomplishment along the bodhisattva path reveals the operation of that fundamental wisdom. Thus, faith and understanding are enough to consummate the immediate and full attainment of Buddhahood, even when the adept has progressed no further than the normal level of the ordinary sentient being. This is the essence of the complete and sudden approach. Although Buddhas and sentient beings are originally only the phantom-like manifestations of the fundamental wisdom of universal brightness, the defilements of passion and discriminative thought have narrowed that wisdom and obscured its brightness. Even though the bodhisattva who realizes this fundamental wisdom is completely endowed with the compassion and wisdom of Buddhahood, his ability to display that wisdom through expedient means of expression and spiritual powers is still inchoate. Consequently, he must continue to cultivate the wide-ranging practices and vows which are developed on the remaining stages of the bodhisattva path. Any defiling actions which might arise from the inertial force of habit must also be corrected. His awakening has given him the ability to see through these habits. However, so he is free to employ appropriate methods during his progression along the path until they subside. Once his practice has been perfected, he will have arrived in fact, as well as potential, at the stage of Buddhahood. Nevertheless, throughout all his subsequent development, the bodhisattva has in fact never strayed from the fundamental unmoving wisdom which was realized upon the initial awakening at the first of the 10 stages of faith. This fundamental wisdom of universal brightness is thus the cause for the attainment of Buddhahood, as well as its fruition, hence its importance in Chinul's system of practice. If practice is to be conducted successfully, the average student requires support from the teachings to explain the course and goal of practice, and to encourage him along that course. At the higher reaches of spiritual development, however, such scriptural explanations can block further progress. As long as the student depends on second-hand descriptions of the enlightened state, he cannot progress to direct experience of that state itself. Although the 2 preceding methods of practice are excellent expedients, especially for beginning students, they still involve an element of conceptualization. Without the concepts of Samādhi, Prajñā, and self-nature, the method of cultivating Samādhi and Prajñā equally would be impossible to comprehend, let alone follow. Without the concepts of fundamental unmoving wisdom, as well as sentient being and discriminative thought, the approach of faith and understanding would have little meaning, let alone utility. While those concepts are a great aid for the student at the inception of his practice, they can only take him to the limits of the operation of the relative mind. Mediation with the unconditioned realm itself is still required to effect the adept's crossing over to the far shore of liberation. The Huadu is designed to act as such a mediator. Thus, Chinul's third approach to practice is the shortcut approach of observing the Huadu, in which all scriptural explanations and conceptual descriptions are avoided, and pure Son is entered. Huadu practice was the product of a long process of development in the later Chan schools of the Middle Tang period in China. Most of the Chan schools during the Tang were characterized by a close master-disciple relationship in which the master's influence and charisma played a central role in inspiring the student, instructing him in his practice, and finally catalyzing the ultimate realization, which is the goal of such practice. Many of the stories which were transmitted about the direct instructions of the early teachers were recorded in a burgeoning literature exclusive to the Chan school. As the creative drive of Chan waned after the mid-800s, later Chan masters began to draw upon these stories as teaching devices for their own students. Teachers in the Linji school especially, among them Nan Yuan, Hui Yang, died 930, Fan Yang Shanzhao, 947 to 1024, and Yuan Wu Guo Qin, 1063 to 1135, used these stories as a systematic way of instructing their students and began to collect them together in large anthologies. These stories came to be called Gong'an, Korean Gong'an, or public case records, because they put an end to private understanding, Gong, and are guaranteed to be in harmony with what the Buddhas and patriarchs would say, An. In its earliest usage in Son texts, Huadu, literally head of speech, meant simply topic, and was parallel in function to the similar terms Huajie, theme of speech, Huabyong, handle of speech, and Huach Uk, rule of speech. In this non-technical sense, Huadu can be taken as the primary topic of the entire situation set out in a complete Kong'an, or test case. Take, for example, the popular Kong'an attributed to Zhao Zhou, Zong Shen, 778 to 897. Does a dog have Buddha nature or not? No. The entire exchange is the Kong'an. The Huadu is dog has no Buddha nature, or simply no. Eventually, the Huadu, the central point of the test case extracted as a concise summary of the entire Kong'an situation, became a topic or subject of meditation in its own right, closely connected with Kong'an investigation, but clearly distinguishable. Huadu practice was popularized in China by Ta Hui Zonggao, 1089 to 1163, a disciple of Yuan Wu Guo Qin in the Linji lineage, who established the method as the formal technique of the Linji school. It was through reading the records of Da Hui, in which Huadu investigation was strongly advocated, that Chinul attained his last and final awakening. From that point on, the use of Huadu played a major role in the whole ensemble of Chinul's thought. Only one generation removed from Ta Hui, Chinul was the first teacher in Korea to advocate the use of Huadu in its formalized sense, and is consequently the forerunner of Korean masters in the late Goryeo period, who placed Huadu practice at the forefront of the various methods of Buddhist meditation. Today in Korea, Huadu is the predominant technique cultivated in meditation halls, and almost all masters advocate its use for students at all levels. Huadu, which means head of speech, can best be taken metaphorically as the apex of speech, or the point beyond which speech exhausts itself. Since the mind is the initiator of speech, speech in this context includes all the discriminating tendencies of the mind itself, in accordance with the classic Indian Abhidharma formula that speech is fundamentally intellection and imagination. Vachi samskara equals vitarka vichara. In leading to the very limit of speech, or more accurately thought, the Huadu acts as a purification device which sweeps the mind free of all its conceptualizing activities, and leaves it clear, attentive, and calm. The ideal meditative state. Cessation of the discriminative processes of thought strips the mind of its interest in the sense experiences of the ordinary world, and renders it receptive to the influence of the unconditioned. Here, as Chinul explains at length in Resolving Doubts about observing the Huadu, and in the Dharma Collection and Special Practice Record, the Huadu produces a cleansing knowledge and understanding which purifies the mind. as this approach allows none of the conventional supports for practice provided in the scriptural teachings and eschews conceptual understanding. It is obviously intended only for students of superior capacity, or for those who have first matured themselves through another technique. The method of Huadu is considered a shortcut to realization because it proposes that enlightenment can be achieved without following the traditional pattern of Buddhist spiritual development through morality, concentration, and wisdom. By focusing the student's attention exclusively on the one thought of the Huadu, all the discriminative tendencies of the mind are brought to a halt. From this state of thoughtlessness, one more push is all that is needed to move from the ordinary world, governed by cause and effect, to the transcendental realm of the unconditioned. This push comes from the force of doubt, which I will explain in a moment. There are two ways to approach investigation of the Huadu, either via the meaning, cha mui, or through the word itself, cham gu. In the case of the Huadu mentioned above, if the student investigates Zhao Zhou's motive for having said no, he is investigating the meaning. If he looks into the word no itself, he is investigating the word. At the beginning of practice, it is often helpful to investigate the meaning, because this examination, being easier and more interesting, expedites the development of the practice. But because this investigation is concerned with the sense of the word no, rather than the word itself, this is called investigating the dead word, sagu. Such investigation leaves the student vulnerable to the same defect, which compromises most other meditation approaches, for it still retains conceptual interpretations. To overcome this defect, it becomes necessary to abandon the interpretive approach and investigate only the word itself. This live word, hualgu, is the weapon which can destroy all the defects still present in approaches involving conceptualization. Investigation of the word alone allows no understanding through the intellect, and is consequently more difficult to perform. There is nothing for the discriminative mind to latch onto for support. Because of this quality, it is sometimes called tasteless, mumi. Throughout Huadu investigation, the very nature of the question stumps the ability of the rational mind to fathom its significance. This perplexity, wonder, or spirit of inquiry is called doubt. As doubt grows, the intensity of the investigation increases, and ordinary dualistic trends of thought are disrupted. Eventually, the fundamental activating consciousness is revealed. As the awakening of faith explains, the activating consciousness is the origin of the deluded mind. It represents the point at which subject and object are bifurcated and dualistic patterns of thought are generated. This activating consciousness impels the individual toward ignorance and craving, and it is only through revealing it that the whole pastiche of defilements can be annihilated, and the original unity of the enlightened mind restored. As the concentration of the mind intensifies through the power of doubt, finally any catalyst, the shout of a master, the blow of his stick, a sudden sound, is enough to break through the activating consciousness, free the original enlightened mind, and display the unconditioned realm. Hence, through investigation of the Huadu, the student can bypass all the gradual stages of development and get to the very source of the problem. And because its investigation can be undertaken at two levels, either through the meaning or through the word itself, the Huadu method is broad enough to accommodate students at all stages of development. Chinul's emphasis in his later works on the shortcut practice of Huadu augured the stronger Imje orientation of his successor, Hyesim, who compiled in 1226 the first Korean collection of Kong'an stories, the Sonmun Yom Song Chip. This posture of Korean Son became more striking as the centuries passed, and it was particularly pronounced after the return from China of Daegopu, who brought the Orthodox Chinese Linji lineage to Korea. Beyond the three basic approaches to Son practice outlined above, Chinul taught another method for people well advanced in their practice. This is the cultivation of no mind which conforms with the path, mushim hapdo mun, or thoughtlessness, munyom, based on the ultimate teachings of the patriarchs of the Son school. Through copious quotations from the writings of major figures in Chinese Buddhism, Chinul demonstrates, in Part 2 of his Dharma collection and special practice record, that all practice entails a leaving behind of words and a severing of thought processes at the moment of realization. This severing of thought, or no mind, is the culmination of all other approaches to practice. Since it is the form which practice takes only after all expedient supports have been dispensed with, it is suitable only for people of the highest spiritual capacity, who can progress without the aid of set methods and conceptual explanations. As the Awakening of Faith explains, the identity between the mind and undifferentiated suchness is destroyed through the operation of the activating consciousness, creating intellection and dualistic thought. A split is then felt between oneself and the objects in one's environment. Through the inception of the succeeding evolving consciousness, this differentiation proliferates throughout the sense spheres as well. The continuation of that process gradually leads the, by then, utterly deluded individual to concretize those perceptions into concepts, that is, to generalize the sense contacts unique to a particular moment along lines which accord with his past experience and understanding. Those concepts are invested with a measure of reality because of their obvious utility in ordering the mass of sense experience. Furthermore, because of the influence of conventional language governed by standardized vocabulary and grammatical rules, those concepts are endowed with an objectivity which is entirely consistent within the conceptual realm. Once those concepts are introduced into the processes of ideation, the whole of one's thought becomes crystallized. Finally, the concepts which had been employed for convenience now overwhelm the individual. All conscious activity and all sense experience are now dominated by understanding which is rooted in those concepts. Even sense perception, otherwise a neutral process, is colored by conceptual understanding, so that objective sense awareness becomes impossible. Pleasant objects become a focus for greed, unpleasant objects for hatred, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant objects for delusion. The only way out of this morass is through the complete demolition of the conceptual scaffolding upon which all mentation is constructed. This is precisely the function of thoughtlessness or no-mind practice. Thoughtlessness in no way implies an absence of conscious activity. To remain simply without thought is to grasp at blankness. It is little different from the insentience of rocks and plants. Thoughtlessness refers rather to the absence of defilements during conscious activity. The maintenance of this pure state of awareness frees the mind from the constraints produced by ignorance and defilement, and restores the basic suchness of the mind. In this way, the original objectivity of sense perception returns, the impulsion of the defilements during sense contact ceases, and spontaneous interaction with the world becomes possible again. In Straight Talk on the True Mind, Chinul describes 10 ways of practicing no mind, through blocking out attention to either sense objects or the activities of thought, or through various combinations of the two. Once any of these 10 methods is brought to perfection, all the others are perfected simultaneously, and thoughtlessness, the noumenal purity of the mind, is achieved. This is possible because all these techniques break the discriminatory tendencies of the mind, which is after all the goal of every method of practice. The state of thoughtlessness so engendered is, finally, the element which enables penetration into the unconditioned sphere, and is consequently a prime constituent of any approach to practice. The difficulties inherent in Buddhist practice led many in China to despair at their ability to achieve progress or realization in their lifetime. Such people often found solace in Pure Land teachings, which claimed that by recollecting the name of the Buddha Amitabha, the disciple could gain entrance into Amitabha's Pure Land in his next life. The Pure Land, a transcendental sphere of existence created through a Buddha's vows, was said to offer ideal conditions for spiritual development. Consequently, by recollecting the Buddha's name and gaining rebirth in that Buddha's Pure Land, great efforts to cultivate the path in this lifetime would be unnecessary. Pure Land practice gained enormous popularity among lay adherents of Buddhism in China, but it was often scorned by followers of other schools. In his earliest work, Encouragement to Practice, Chinul too showed little sympathy for Pure Land beliefs. He assumed that they foster complacency by denying the need to cultivate Samādhi and Prajñā in this life, and by holding out hopes of future reward without requiring present effort. In one of his later works, however, The Essentials of Pure Land Practice, Chinul takes a closer look at Pure Land practice and interprets it in such a way that it too can lead to the same goal as other forms of Buddhist practice. This is Chinul's 5th approach to practice, recollection of the Buddha, which was intended for ordinary men with minimal ability in spiritual matters. In this approach, Chinul outlines 10 stages in the development of recollection. The influence of the Pure Land schemes of Zhengguan and Zongmi on Chinul's approach is readily apparent. Beginning with simple verbal recitation, the practice eventually leads to recollection of the Buddha in thoughtlessness and finally in suchness. Hence it is a self-contained method which leads to realization of the one true Dharmadhatu, the goal of both Son and Hwaom practice, in this very life. Although this approach is of minor importance in the full spectrum of Chinul's thought, the fact that he was willing to espouse it at all shows again his concern that people of all abilities and interests be able to find a method of practice suited to their own unique needs. By receiving proper direction in the use of that method, they should be able to achieve the same results as are forthcoming from all other types of Buddhist practice.